All right, well, good to have everyone here. We'll go ahead and get started with our last library talk of the semester, The Way of Christ and Culture, A Vision for All of Life. Wonder where I got that title. We're delighted to have you all here. At each library talk, I like to remind people of our mission statement and contextualize and explain why we do these library talks. So I'll read it to you. The library at Southeastern exists to engage the Southeastern community with services and resources to equip them to serve the church and fulfill the Great Commission. And that's what we're trying to do with this, among many of our other services. We want to bring the campus community together, address important matters in Christian life, thought, and practice. So again, one of the many ways we try to fulfill that mission is through library talks, and this is the last one of the semester. I'm really excited about this conversation. I loved the book, really enjoyed it, packed a lot into a very few number of pages. That's impressive. Really enjoyed reading your book. As I said, we have a giveaway if you haven't signed up over here. We also have donuts and coffee. We have some Thanksgiving donuts. They may not still be there. I see quite a few of you have already gotten some donuts, but we got some special Thanksgiving donuts if you're interested. Also, as we did last time, we're going to use the Slido app. So if you have a smartphone, if you could pull it out and download the Slido app if you might ask questions. And the code that you're looking to use is Culture Talk. One word, Culture Talk, all caps or not, it'll recognize it. Culture Talk. I'll say that one more time before we start. But if you want to ask questions, go ahead and download the Slido app. Let me introduce Dr. Quinn. Dr. Quinn is the Associate Professor of Theology and the History of Ideas and the Director of the Center for Faith and Culture here at Subbits. He received his PhD from the University of Bristol. Where in the UK is that?
Southwest England.
Okay, Southwest England, focusing on Augustine, not Augustine.
That's right.
Right.
Augustine.
Okay.
Augustine is a city in Florida.
Exactly.
And a type of grass.
Exactly.
Augustine is the saint that we appreciate.
The city in Florida is wonderful. I'm from Florida. Love it, St. Augustine. He's also the pastor of Holly Grove Baptist Church in Spring Hope. And so thank you for being here again, Dr. Quinn. Let's just dive right in. Easy question, softball. Why'd you write this book?
Yeah, so the co-author and I, his name's Dennis Greason. Dennis is a very dear friend. He's a graduate of our institution, did his PhD here in public theology. And Dennis, for a time, was working for B&H Academic as one of their acquisitions editors. And he and I were just talking about areas in the kind of the B&H academic corpus or catalog that needed to be filled out. And the faith and culture area was a place that he and I both had a lot of interest, but also felt like B&H is a place we'd like to see do some good work here. And so he and I both began to kind of dream together a bit about what would a series look like that are just primers, short primers, and by that we mean 30 to 35,000 words roughly, that address specific cultural issues. And so we started kind of sketching out a handful of these and then backed up and said, well, somebody's got to write an introduction to this whole thing, so why don't you and I do that together? So that's what Dennis and I did. It was really meant to set the table of conversation for additional primers to come out.
Now, have any of those other books been published?
Yeah, the one that Dr. Keithley wrote, which is a kind of an introduction to faith and science, it's already out. That's one of those. There are a couple of others. Brad Littlejohn has one on freedom, a Christian view of freedom, and he talks about it in 3 different ways. That comes out, I believe, in January. And then there are a few others. Matt Capps wrote one on beauty that's coming out, I think, maybe in January as well. Lainey Greer, who's a PhD from Southeastern Seminary under Greg Allison, is writing one on, I'll get the exact title wrong, but basically a whole life body discipleship. So basically how not to only be godly spiritually, but how to be godly with respect to discipline of the body and a high theology of the body. John Wilsey is also writing one on a Christian view of citizenship. And then I'm hopeful we can contract some others in the future.
I love it. Great. So there's some resources for you. You are a library. We are a library. We like to tell people about books. So we'll be talking about a number of resources as we go. But let's focus on your book in particular. I'm just going to kind of walk through the book chapter by chapter. We don't always do that in our library talks, but this is essentially a library book talk where we're working through the book kind of chapter by chapter, trying to understand the argument. So chapter 2 is titled Culture Defined. So let's just start. What is culture, and what are some different approaches to culture? You guys commend a blended approach. Maybe why do you recommend that approach? But kind of synthesize some of the material from that chapter.
Yeah, so just to set this conversation, I didn't write every chapter, so Dennis and I genuinely divided this responsibility. So this particular chapter, he and I kind of worked on together. Here's how we define culture. Culture is the ways and products of creatures in creation. The ways and products of creatures in creation. Part of the benefit to that kind of a definition is the fact that you can walk out of here and in 30 minutes come real close to remembering that definition. It's still a very memorable way to talk about it, the ways and products of creatures in creation. Also, what we're trying to get after with that is to account for the whole of the Christian experience, to account for who we are as creatures. That's why we say the ways and products of creatures in creation. Account for ourselves as creatures, but also account for not merely reduce the definition just to the end products. Some people do that. Not to take merely kind of a sociological approach, which is just sort of evaluating how the sociological dimensions and habits and so on and so forth, sort of cultural phenomena. That's a dimension of this. All these things are important parts of it, but we wanted to account for the whole thing in a way that's very memorable. And I think you'll get to this, Rob, by the end of our time here. But when we use the language of ways, that sort of anchors the conversation in a really thick biblical theme and metaphor for all of life.
And we'll talk more about that a little later. I think some of that comes out of your dissertation research, if I'm not mistaken.
It probably does. Some of this may be subconscious by this point.
Okay.
I've just been thinking about and talking about and teaching about and reading about this for so long. Some of it probably does sort of spring out of that. But I think more of it just comes from, I think the Bible's favorite metaphor and most common kind of mega metaphor for life before God is this language of walking in a certain way, that we walk in a particular way before the Lord. You can think of anything from Genesis, walking with the Lord in the garden, to Deuteronomy chapter 10, one of these places where Moses kind of backs up and says, hey, let me get out of the weeds for a second. What is it that the Lord requires us? Except that we love him, fear him, and walk in his ways. To the beginning of the Psalter, the kind of human being that walks and lives in a certain way, to the whole of Proverbs, and then on that it goes. Jesus, who says, not only is he the truth and the life, but he is the way and the truth and the life. And then Paul over and over and over and over, and John as well, tell us to walk in a certain way, walk worthy of our calling in Christ. And so I think it ties into all of that, a real thick biblical theme.
That's great. That's great. Okay, great. Good summary there of chapter 2. That's very helpful. Let's move to chapter 3, typologies of culture. Now, everyone has a handout here. You might want to take a look at that. We're going slightly into class mode here. We don't always do that in library talks. We'll go a little bit into class mode. There's a lot in this chapter, but I really want to talk about 2 of the typologies that you and Dennis discuss. So Christ and culture and nature and grace. This is a really helpful way to think about culture and Christian approach to culture. So can you kind of just talk us through some of this material? You don't necessarily have to walk through each option here, but maybe big picture thinking about Christ and culture, big picture thinking about nature and grace, and then maybe particularly which of these options you all would commend.
Yep. So in this chapter, there are actually 3 different sort of approaches or typologies of culture that we discussed. The 2 that Rob is asking us to talk about, he has this on your page here. Probably the most well-known 20th century volume on kind of faith and culture relationships is Niebuhr's volume, Christ and Culture. How many of you have at least heard of it, if not read Niebuhr's Christ and Culture? I would strongly encourage you to read it, not because you're going to agree with everything in it, but because he provides these categories for how to think about the Christian relationship to culture that at this point, you kind of at least have to know the categories, at least be aware. And what these typologies do is just to give you an illustration. They just give you kind of a mind picture or a word picture for the way in which we relate to the culture. Niebuhr does it by centering the conversation on the person of Jesus. And so the organizing principle for that is, how does Christ relate to culture? And then he gives different examples of that. So his 5 examples, you have this on your sheet. Christ against culture. In fact, I want to read these, and then I'd be curious. We are kind of in class mode. He's given me permission for this. I want to read these and then hear from you guys which one seems to map onto your experience thus far, maybe the church that you were a part of, the way that you were discipled or formed. So Christ against culture. I'll put my cards on the table. That was the way that, at least early on in my life, I was formed. It was very much a kind of a culture warrior mentality. The assumption is that The assumption is that culture is bad, and the underlying assumption is that the world itself is bad. It has a low view of creation. The world itself is bad. And so the goal is to save souls, hunker down, wait for Jesus to come back, and that's how we relate to culture. Niebuhr uses the example of Tertullian historically as someone who does that. Tertullian famously said, "What has Jerusalem to do with Athens?" And that kind of illustrates his Christ against culture posture. The second is a Christ of culture. Again, the descriptions and the examples come from Niebuhr. That's not me and Dennis making this up. We're just telling you what Niebuhr's saying here. And the Christ of culture is kind of the classic liberal approach, or for some of you, perhaps you grew up in some type of a mainline denomination where who is Jesus and what is the gospel kind of is whatever the culture tells you that it is. It's some very nebulous and squishy form of love and accommodation, and that becomes that type of Christ of culture posture. Christ above culture is one that sometimes you might even think of this as a bit of a monastic kind of approach. That's my language, not Dennis's. But Christ above culture teaches on spiritual and earthly life. It emphasizes the spiritual versus the earthly life, and suggests, you might even see this in some kind of sacramental writing. It recognizes Christ as sort of standing above creation in a way as to call everything else up to it, almost in this participate in sort of this spiritual idealistic type of living. And that's how we relate to culture. We call all things kind of up into that. You might even call it a contemplative mode. Fourth would be Christ and culture and paradox. Niebuhr puts Paul and Luther here. Sometimes students get tripped up about that. They're like, well, I'm where Paul is. And it's like, well, Niebuhr may be wrong about that, first of all. But secondly, he's just trying to describe certain models. But it is a helpful example. This also, it ties in well with the second one, the nature and grace examples, where the grace alongside nature and I think the Christ and culture and paradox come really close to each other. When you think about Christ and culture and paradox, this is where you may experience life in this way, where you think, I know that I need to be a good employee, and I'm trying to do that, but I'm also, what's more important to me is that I'm really faithful in my church, that I'm a good Christian, and you're not always sure how those things go together. You feel a certain tension there, you feel a certain paradox. You don't know that they're mutually exclusive, but you're not quite sure how they go together. Sometimes they feel like they fight more than they agree, and you're just happy to live in the tension. And that's kind of the Christ and culture and paradox experience. The fifth, which is the one that I think Niebuhr recommends, it's certainly, if we're using that model, the ones that we would recommend, is the Christ, the transformer of culture, which is where Christians should work to see all of culture transformed by Christ. Now, let me get to the second example, though, the nature and grace, and this comes from Herman Bavinck, who more popularized, and this is a longer conversation in terms of historically, but Bavinck uses this language. And Dennis and I preferred the nature-grace paradigm over Christ and culture paradigm because it accounts for the whole of the biblical story in a way that the Christ and culture paradigm doesn't so much. When you think about nature and grace, those two words, the word nature is basically a one-word shorthand for the whole of creation. And then grace being that specific work or that part of the biblical story that is, this is the gospel of Jesus. Now, how does the gospel then relate to the whole of creation, or how does grace relate to nature? And Bavinck gives us four examples or four postures. One would be grace above nature. That would be kind of that monastic notion that I mentioned earlier. One would be grace opposed to nature. That would be very close to that Christ against culture, that grace is opposed to nature in sort of an animosity kind of posture. Grace alongside nature would be a little bit more of that Lutheran. I go to work. I think that there may be something related there, but I'm not quite sure how they relate. I just go to work. And then the fourth one rather, is the one that we would recommend. Grace infuses and restores nature, where we actually see the story of the gospel is the story of the whole world, and that we, as we are saved by Jesus, as we are filled with his Spirit, that actually the work that we do in all of these areas of our life, whether that's actually in your workplace, your community, your home, your church, even I think a fifth vocational category we can add now in the 21st century is the social spaces, that is kind of the social media or the virtual worlds and spaces that we occupy, that the degree to which we sort of live and apply the Spirit-filled life and the gospel to each of these areas, you should expect to see the needle move towards that which is good, true, and beautiful. Now, sometimes you'll provoke idols in those ways that might get you killed. Sometimes you'll provoke persecution. But we also shouldn't be surprised when people taste of that which is good, true, and beautiful in a true sense, in a gospel, God-oriented, Christ-centered sense. And all of a sudden, you see culture actually improve in certain ways. Doesn't always work that way, and we're not saying that this is another part of kind of the definitions thing. There's some people who that's all they're after is kind of this triumphalistic approach to culture, and that's not what we're saying. Sometimes this approach to culture will get you imprisoned. In fact, there's one particular Chinese pastor named Wang Yi who is precisely that. He took this approach to culture, was honored by George Bush, President 43, was also honored by Tim Keller a number of years ago, but now for the last 7 or 8 years has been in prison because he holds to this, that actually we should seek to live faithfully in the culture. So that's kind of our approach.
I was kind of interested, maybe we'll just do a show of hands here real quick. You talked about maybe getting a little feedback. Probably don't have time for everyone to speak into it, but show of hands, maybe did you grow up with a Christ against culture approach? Okay, pretty common. Christ of culture, anybody? Got 0 on that. Christ above culture? Okay. Christ and culture and paradox?
Mine was somewhere between Christ against and Christ and culture and paradox.
Okay,
yeah.
And then maybe finally the right way, right? No, the Christ, the transformer of culture. Okay, we got a good representation here. That's very interesting and helpful. Okay,
I'm really surprised there were as many Christ above culture. I would have thought more Christ of culture. We have a number of students I've talked to who said, I didn't know it, but that's exactly what I was formed in.
Okay, really good. Helpful typologies of culture, starting to kind of sense what's going on here in this book and in this discussion. We are about to do a speed round, but let me ask one more question, and then we'll transition to a speed round. Chapter 4, okay, creator and creatures, the ways and products of creatures and creation. So now you want to think some about what does it actually mean to be human? What does it mean to be a creature? And you guys talk about the structure and purpose of human beings. Can you summarize that discussion for us? What do you mean by the structure of human beings and then their purpose? Maybe relate that then to the question of culture.
So if we're going to define culture as the ways and products of creatures in creation, and we're doing this from a distinctly Christian vantage point, we felt like it was really important that we have a straightforward conversation about, okay, who is the creator? Who is this God that we're talking about? And then who are we as creatures, as the imagers of God or the image bearers of God? And this also takes a little bit of insight from Herman Bavinck has these worldview questions, at least 3 of them, that says the first one is, what am I? What is the world? And what's my job in the world? What's my responsibility? And so that helps to inform this conversation a bit. First, with respect to creator and creatures is the title of that chapter. We just want to be very clear. The God that we're talking about is the God who has revealed himself to us as Father, Son, and Spirit, that the church has confessed faithfully now through some of these ancient creeds, like the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed. And we think it's really important to say that because even though we're not, we may really appreciate our Mormon and Jehovah's Witness neighbors and may link arms with them on certain moral issues and cultural values and what have you. This is a different God than they proclaim. And so we want to be really clear about the God that we're talking about. But then also when it comes to who we are, and your question about structure and purpose or structure and direction is maybe a better way to say it. If we're going to take this approach to Christ and culture, first of all, this is an approach that has a very high view of creation. It's an approach that assumes and is quite keen to confess that what God made good, sin did not make bad. Sin has twisted, has misdirected, has perverted, and can reap all kind of damage in God's world. It's exactly, I think, what's taking place in Genesis 3, that sin seizes the opportunity to do all kinds of damage. But sin, first of all, sin can't create anything, nor can human beings. We can't create anything brand new, de novo, ex nihilo, like God does. We can't do that. We can only work from the stuff that God's already given us and then create new things. Sin can't create anything either, and it also can't annihilate anything. It doesn't have that kind of power. But what it can do is pervert, misdirect, twist, all these kinds of things, the whole of creation. Now that said, if we have that high view of creation as a whole, and especially of human beings, those who are made in the image of God, we want to be really clear about who are we as human beings. We don't take a Christ above culture or a grace above nature approach. And what that would look like as an anthropology would be something like a dualistic approach that privileges the soul over the human body and might say something like, okay, well, who am I? Well, I am my soul. I just happen to have a body kind of by accident, and I want to do good things in the body. I want to do what Paul tells us to do in 1 Corinthians to glorify God in the body, but really it's not necessary. It's just kind of a secondary matter. And to be clear, there are plenty of people in the Christian tradition that have said something like that. Even many today that would still say that's my view of anthropology. That's not where we're at. We take a particular view that you guys have probably heard called the hylomorphic view, and I'm no expert on this perspective, but here's where it plays in here, is that we recognize that human beings are both body and soul, and these are equal and irreducible parts to what it means to be human. We're not saying that the soul and the body are the same thing or that they function the same way, but that they relate to one another in such a way that we see the soul animates the body, that they are integrally connected, and that the soul animates the body in a way that actually doesn't privilege the soul in some ontological superiority sense. There may be kind of a chronological priority in some sense, but a cause and effect kind of thing, but not an ontological priority, but rather living out faithfully, living out the Spirit-filled life in the body, and doing so in the world that is always encultured. It's not as though you can ever live or be in a place that is outside of culture. It's always cultured. Even when Jesus himself comes and takes on flesh, the very thing that he does, that's the most central part of his ministry, is that he dies on a cross for us and then rises from the grave. But that very cross, the very image of a cross itself, that's a cultural product. And in fact, it's a cultural product that would be almost the equivalent of the skull and crossbones of our day. Preachers will often talk about the cross as kind of like the electric chair for our day. And maybe there's a sense of that, but I think it was the symbol of death in a way that maybe the skull and crossbones are for us today. And our God, in his wisdom and providence, takes that symbol of death and actually turns it into the means of life everlasting. And he does that in the body, as well as with a soul, a full human body, and then calls us to live the same type of incarnational life in this world, in culture, and to do so filled by his Spirit. So we just want to be really clear about the way in which we understand who we are as human beings is not one that says, look, all you got to do is pray and read your Bible and you're good to go. That's all that really matters. No, those things are really important. Don't misunderstand. But I know plenty of people who pray and read their Bible and scream at their wives and beat their kids. I don't know a lot of people that beat their kids, but that stuff happens. And actually, to be faithful to Jesus is to be faithful in body and soul and recognize that he's built us that way on purpose. And in fact, even in the life to come, we can fully expect to live in that way on purpose.
Say amen to that. That's beautiful. Fully agree. Okay, let's do a little speed round. This is fun. Y'all should know I stole this idea from Dr. Quinn last fall when he did a library talk with Dr. Gavin Ortland. So you get credit for the existence of the speed round in the library talk. Or
the blame, however you want to see it.
Hopefully credit. I like speed rounds, so oh well. Here we go. Favorite city in America?
Jackson Hole, Wyoming, or Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Tennessee. I'm going to go with that one.
And just quick reason why.
It's part of it's nostalgic. Just family always went there, but also just loved it. I love the mountains. I've been trying to move to the mountains for 100 years in many ways, and maybe one day the Lord will let me live there. But
retirement plan.
Yeah, maybe so. But there's something about I talk to people about this often. I've spent a good bit of time out west, and I love the Rockies and kind of the majesty of them. But there's an intimacy about the Smoky Mountains and Appalachia that you don't get out west, and Gatlinburg is kind of one example of that.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. All right, you can settle a debate that's been going on in the library. Should people decorate for Christmas before or after Thanksgiving?
Before and after and every month in between.
Okay, all right. I stand corrected. All right. Favorite sport and why?
Baseball, because it's the best.
Okay.
I love all kinds of stuff. I grew up, my liturgical calendar growing up was baseball, basketball, football season. But I would say...
Jason didn't pay you to say this?
He did not pay me to say it. And there were seasons of life when football may have been my favorite because I needed to work out some aggression. But I think in the big scheme, baseball was the longest love.
Okay, great. Two favorite hobbies. Now, that's a contradiction in terms as I'm looking at it, but go ahead, go after two. Two favorites. Is that a thing? I don't think so.
Hunting and music in no particular order.
Okay. Do you produce music or just listen?
Both.
Okay, what do you play?
Piano, guitar, and sing.
Okay. I didn't know any of that about you. That's incredible. Do you lead worship at your church by any chance?
Sometimes. Okay. I preach most of the time, but actually this Sunday I'm leading worship. Our worship minister is going to be out. But before coming to Southeastern, in fact, the hardest part about the decision to move to North Carolina was leaving the praise team that we led and had done for quite some time. But then came here, and from 2006 to 2010, at the church where I serve now, was their music guy for 4 years.
Okay. Oh, that's great. I didn't know that. Awesome. What are you currently reading?
That's a hard question
That is
because
a hard
there's a stack of books that I'm working, and it just depends on what questions I'm working through at the
Pick
time.
one or two. Pick one or two.
So Van Hooser's new book on hermeneutics is on my shelf, and I'm working through that slowly but surely. I love Van Hooser's work. Another one is something I'm teaching through Theology 2 right now, and so we're getting ready to start in eschatology, and I haven't taught that in a long time, and so I'm working through eschatology stuff and reading various systematics on how people approach cosmic, personal eschatology, and so on.
Yeah, if anyone here is interested in the theological interpretation of Scripture, Kevin Van Hooser's new book, Mere Christian Hermeneutics, may or may not be checked out in my office, but you can place a hold on it. You could recall it. Either our options are available to you, and I will gladly give it up. Or not gladly, I will give it
working through Tom Holland's Dominion as well,
Okay.
so that's fun.
Yeah. Okay, last speed round question. Best book on Christ and culture, and you can only pick one, and not your own.
It's really hard.
All right, I'll give you two.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's hard because when you're talking about faith and culture or public theology or Christ and culture, there are a lot of different types of books. So sometimes people will come and say, look, you're the director of the Center for Faith and Culture, and they'll say, so tell me the top 5 books on public theology. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? What are you looking for? And sometimes it's a mix between certain cultural apologetics books, or maybe it's something like Niebuhr's Christ and Culture, or even some of the responses to that, like D.A. Carson's Christ and Culture Revisited. And sometimes it's just ethics books or doctrine of Christian life kind of books they're looking for. And so where we live and sit is right at that intersection. But to your question, two that I think about a lot, and I've referenced a lot, are Al Wolter's Creation Regained and Cornelius Plantinga. What's the title of that book, Rob? Cornelius Plantinga, Engaging God's World.
Okay. Great. Well, there you go. A couple recommendations, post-library talk reading, and hopefully you've gotten to know Dr. Quinn a little bit more. I certainly did, and really enjoyed that. All right, let's pivot back now to the book. We're in chapter 5 at this point. Chapter 5 is titled Wisdom's Way. You write this: our fundamental proposal is that the biblical notion of walking in the way of wisdom is the best approach for cultural engagement. Can you explain this claim in more detail, and then talk to us a little bit more, you already talked some, about the metaphor of walking along the way and the centrality of the concept of wisdom in your cultural engagement? I know that's kind of a lot,
Yep.
but...
So first of all, this is not entirely unique to me or to us. So one of my doctoral supervisors was Craig Bartholomew, and one of the books that I would also have to mention in that is Living at the Crossroads, that Bartholomew and Goheen wrote a number of years ago. It's a fantastic book. It's really subtitled about Christian worldview, but it's a faith and culture book. It's a how to relate to culture and how to live faithfully therein. Craig talks a lot about wisdom. William Durness out of California has talked a lot about wisdom in relation to cultural issues over the years. Van Hooser will sometimes talk about this. I think, though, to the point about chapter 5, I think when it comes to living faithfully before God and His world, and therefore a posture and an approach to culture that honors the Lord and blesses our neighbor. And I say that very much on purpose. In other words, a way of living that is faithful to what Jesus calls the most important thing about living in His world, loving God and loving other people. If we're going to do that, we need to situate ourselves in a particular place to provide a posture and an approach that doesn't sort of force us into myopia on one side, where we're narrow-minded, narrow-visioned, but also not on the other side where we're so broad we're not actually doing anything. And I think that biblically speaking, that place begins at what the Proverbs call the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of right knowledge, according to Proverbs 1:7, and the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, according to Proverbs 9:10. And then the rest of, especially the book of Proverbs, which I think is so illustrative for us here, the rest of the book of Proverbs is teaching us how to walk faithfully. Listen, think about just the opening chapters, that sort of chapters 1 through 9, but especially the first 2, 3, 4, 5 chapters. Listen, my son, to your father's instruction. Hear your mother's teaching. In other words, sit at our feet, and that is the word of Christ Himself. Sit at His feet. Receive that instruction, and then when you get to chapter 10 of Proverbs and go all the way to the end, part of the reason why it seems so random is because it's just like every day of your life. It's not like you decided, okay, when I'm 21, I'm going to be wise with my money. And then at 22, I'm going to be wise with my family. And then at 23, I'm going to be a hard worker and stop being lazy, as though you could silo life in these ways. Rather, the assumption is that we have been formed or discipled, as it were, even catechized into a particular posture and an approach that begins with the fear of the Lord, because that's the right place for all these things. It aims toward, the end of this whole thing is to love God and neighbor. And the way in which we go about that is walking faithfully in wisdom, just like the Proverbs teach us all the way through. So that on a day-to-day basis, you're making financial decisions. On a day-to-day basis, you're making relationship decisions. What kind of friend are you going to be today? On a day-to-day basis, you're making work decisions. Am I going to be a good employee, a bad employee, a good boss, a bad boss, a mean friend, a not mean? I mean, you're making all these decisions all the time. And so wisdom helps to account for a way of living in the world, or a way of walking in the world, that promotes wise living, God-honoring, neighbor-loving type of life in every part of life. And if that becomes our posture, our approach, our pace, our walk, our cadence, our aim, our character, and everything else, if that becomes part of who we are, formed in that way of walking faithfully with Jesus, I promise you will impact the culture around you in a way that will bless Jesus and bless your neighbor.
Yeah, that's great. And I love how you went to Proverbs. As you were talking about the way of wisdom in Proverbs, I actually went to Jesus himself, right? He comes into the world and among many other things shows us that way of wisdom.
So let me jump to that. So
go ahead.
Part of what Jesus does is, it's not as though this is Proverbs tells us this and it's distant from Jesus. Who is Jesus? Paul's the one who tells us in 1 Corinthians 1:24 that Jesus is the wisdom and power of God. Jesus is wisdom. And he is the one who, by virtue of his birth, his life, his death, his burial, and his resurrection, by virtue of all of that, he restores our own way to the Father as the one who is the way and the truth and the life. Fills us with his very Spirit that now enables us no longer to be slaves of sin, but actually enables us to walk like him in the rest of life.
Absolutely. That's great. All right, let's spend a good bit of time talking about chapters 6 and 7. You'll want to look at your handout here again. We're going to talk a little bit about this concept of triangulation in cultural engagement. So if you could just kind of sketch what you guys are after there. Let me hand you this. Triangulation, locating ourselves on the map of cultural engagement. Explain that to us, and then I'll ask you a couple specific questions about cultural engagement. So
when Dennis and I were thinking about this, and for full disclosure, chapters 6 and 7 were primarily Dennis's work. He was the chief architect there, and he and I had good conversations along the way. But, we didn't want to have just another kind of theoretical heavy approach to this. We wanted to be able for people who read this volume to walk away with some practical questions, or maybe a practical guide towards how do we actually practice this thing. If we're teaching people something is practical, or we're arguing for something as practical as walk faithfully in God's world, well then let's have some practical whatabouts and what to do's by the end of the book. So that's where these chapters came from. And Dennis very helpfully sort of boiled these down to, here are the kind of questions that we have to ask. We don't pretend to have every answer to these questions, but it seems to me, especially in a context like a seminary or any kind of an institution similar to this, part of the formation that we are providing as professors and that people are receiving as students is you're receiving a certain kind of equipment. An equipment that will prepare you for a life of ministry and mission and whatever God's called you to do. But I tell my students all the time, I don't pretend to have all the answers. And part of the reason, one, is because I'm merely human and I'm not all that smart. But secondly is because I can't anticipate every question that you'll have to deal with. My responsibility, at least in part, is to provide for you the kinds of questions. If you just know what questions to ask when you enter into or experience some new situation that you think, I didn't take that class, but I hope that you can rely and lean back on, but Dr. Quinn or Dr. So-and-so or Dr. So-and-so, they gave me the questions to ask that I think can help me to navigate this with God's help. That's what these chapters are trying to do. So when it comes to cultural issues, there are three big questions that we want to encourage you to ask. One is, when are we? And I'll explain these in just a minute. When are we? Second is, where are we? So recognize the first one is a time question. When are we? And that's specifically, when are we in the biblical story? Second is, where are we? Think about that as, where are we on the cultural map right now? What is the time and place in which we're in right now? And then the third one is, How do we get to where we need to go? How do we get there? How do we walk faithfully in this particular time and place? These are then relatively intuitive, I think, after you explain them that way. But the first one is when we ask the question, when are we? Here is an example of when we are not. We are not in the time of Joseph, where at the end of Genesis, Joseph is second in command of the greatest superpower of his day, and things are looking up for God's people. Okay, that's not where we are. Nor are we let's just stay in Egypt for a second, nor are we in Egypt in the day of Moses, when after you close the book of Genesis and open the book of Exodus, a few hundred years have passed, quite a bit of time has passed, and the pharaohs didn't remember Joseph, but the Hebrew people populated a lot and kind of intimidated the Egyptians, and so the Egyptians have basically oppressed them, made them slaves, and you open up that book and go, oh my, same place, but quite a different time, and God's going to do something different here, and he's going to raise Moses up to rescue his people, a proto-gospel in a sense, pointing us towards that kind of rescue that we can expect even with Jesus. The time in which we live is the time between the advents of Jesus. We're also not people who live in the exile in Babylon. We're not people who are looking to go back to the homeland and are still waiting for the Messiah to come. We are a people who remember the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, the one who died for us and who rose again. And on the authority of that resurrection, we also believe that he will return. And by the way, just a fun little quick pastoral and theological tidbit. The degree to which you are convinced or confident in the resurrection is directly proportionate to the confidence that you have that he will return. And that has everything to do, by the way, with how you live. If you could kind of put your confidence in a test tube in some sense, and you have a little bit of confidence that Jesus rose from the dead, you're not that worried about what the Bible calls the day of the Lord, the day of Jesus' return, and it's not affecting the way that you live. If you have high confidence, I really believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And just to pull the curtain back on Dr. Quinn for just a minute, I have massive confidence that Jesus rose from the dead. So much so that just about every morning that I get up, I'm reminded, why do I do this again? Because Jesus rose from the dead. And I'm confident that he's coming back. And that shapes everything about the way that I live in between. That's the time in which we are in. So when are we? We're at the time between the times. We're in the age of the church. We're in the age where we've been given the Great Commission. And we live in a time when our first responsibility to love God and neighbor and to be about the business of making disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of this Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and trusting that the Lord is with us all the way into the end. Where are we then? And this is so critical for any of you who are thinking about especially missionary work, but even if you're planning on pastoral work. If you pastor, let's just say that you pastor where I live out in the Bunn Spring Hope area in 2024. That's the year we're in now, right? If you pastor out there in 2024. There's a particular approach to the way in which you would minister to people there. There's a contextual approach that you would take there that is very different from my very dear friend Eric, who planted a church in Naples, Florida 2 years ago. Very different. And we'd say, well, he's still in the South. No, he's not. I don't know if you've been to South Florida, but it's not the South. It's quite different. Or other friends that may be in Seattle, or somebody else who's in Alberta, Canada, or someone else who's in Paris. That each of these, has the gospel changed? Has our theological convictions changed? Of course not. But the way in which we appropriate those things, the way in which we share the gospel, the way in which we go about worship expressions, and the way in which you disciple people, these things will look different depending on where you are. And that's why you ask that question when it comes to cultural engagement. And then, how do we get to where we want to go in terms of, let's just imagine that you're in a context where you see some serious issues in your culture, maybe some serious sin issues or idolatries, and you think, I really want to address those things. Well, we'll have to ask careful questions, and I won't belabor the point here. These are usually long and drawn-out discussions, but if there are particular issues in your life, in your family, in your particular ministry context or culture, and you think, I really want to see the gospel shine bright on that issue, considering when we are and where we are, we'll shine light on, okay, how do I walk faithfully towards that issue? There may be some things that you need to confront full stop and just have to take the heat for it. There may be other things where you say, you know what, this is something I'm going to take the long game, and I'm going to slowly just seek to subvert that kind of cultural idol, and I want to remain faithful to Jesus in the process. Then you may see some other things that you think, you know what, it's just different than where I grew up. It's not a hill to die on. I'll give you one example of that one, by the way, is I didn't grow up taking my shoes off every time we went inside, but I've been to places, lived in places temporarily, and visited places where if you don't take your shoes off, you really offend people. I could see that as, well, you know what? I don't care to take my shoes off every time I go in. My feet smell too bad for that kind of stuff. But I would rather just help these folks. If it really offends them not to take your shoes off, then just take your shoes off. It's not that big a deal. There are other things, though, that may be more of a serious gospel compromise or something you have to work through. And that's where the questions that we ask are, how do I walk faithfully with Jesus in this issue? And we just want to give you guys the questions that help to navigate those kind of things for the sake of faithfulness to Christ in the culture.
Great.
Please don't take your shoes off here. Rob. Thank you.
I'll keep them on. I love the rubric. I love the framework. I want to take a little bit of time here to ask one or two specific questions. I think before I do that, though, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more broadly about how you think about where Western culture and American culture is at this moment. Now, of course, there's all kinds of subcultures. You just referenced one, pastoring, out in rural Spring Hope versus maybe someone working in downtown Raleigh. But just maybe this wasn't prepared, so I'm sorry for throwing this at you. I think you're ready for it. Maybe start by just painting a little bit in broad strokes about where we're at in the West at this moment, where we're at in American culture, how you think about it, and then I'll ask maybe one or two very specific questions. Perhaps some folks will have other questions to ask. We'll look at Slido in a second, but
yeah,
help us think a little bit more with your triangulation model about where we're at in the West in 2024.
I'll tell you what comes to mind immediately is, so earlier this semester, Trevin Wax came and spoke as part of our Drummond Bush lecture. In fact, we did a library talk with Trevin as well while he was here. And he addressed this very thing and talked about kind of 4 to 5 key areas, or at least key kind of markers for where we are in the West right now in terms of cultural trends and manifestations or phenomena at the moment. And I just want to recommend that. We actually just got the video back. It should be posted at the CFC website very soon, if not already. So I want to recommend that as a longer, more thorough conversation. But one of the 4 or 5 things that Trevin mentioned that he's absolutely spot on about is the entire kind of phenomenon of expressive individualism. And so this has manifested itself in multiple ways. This doesn't surprise anybody in the room or on the camera, I wouldn't think, in terms of it goes that kind of ideology, or even if you want that kind of religious commitment or faith commitment, it goes something like this. First of all, we have to recognize that there are a lot of people in our world, and especially in the West is the question. There are a lot of people in our world who sincerely believe, let me just call this the Hallmark gospel. It's Hallmark season. Some of you you've already binged 3 or 4 of these Hallmark movies. And to be honest with you, I don't mind them that much. Like they're warm and fuzzy, and I'm like a cozy guy. That's why I've got a coat on, right? I like that kind of stuff. And Christmas is my favorite time of the season. That's why my wife and I got married at Christmas. And I think that the new heavens, new earth is basically like November, December. That's what it is. But the Hallmark gospel, and Trevin doesn't say it this way, but I think he's getting at the same point. The Hallmark gospel goes something like this, that the great commandment of what we'll call the Hallmark gospel, or if you will, the golden rule, is to be true to yourself. Okay? Be true to yourself. And it's sometimes, maybe a little more of an old-fashioned way of saying that is follow your, fill it in, heart. Now, some of you are like, that's why I came to Southeastern. I followed. Please don't tell me that if that's true. But if the great commandment, or if the golden rule of life is be true to yourself, and especially if you've lopped off this notion that there's no transcendent truth or no transcendent being, divine being that is defining self for me, I sort of autonomously define self for myself. And then to be true to myself basically just means live your feelings. Even if my outside doesn't match my inside, the most true and authentic thing that I can do is to make sure that my outside matches my inside. Whether that's transgenderism, whether that's just merely that I'm going to live an LGBTQ lifestyle, or even, I'm not trying to be funny, but you guys know the whole furries movement. I mean, my kids are in public school, and it is not uncommon that they come back. My 12-year-old the other day said, "Dad, there was a cat in my class the other day, and it chased me down the hallway." And we might want to chuckle about that, except the fact that there are people who really are trying to live this out. They really, really are. I'm not trying to be funny about it. I'm just saying the logical extension, the logical conclusion of that ideology, even that religion, is if that's what you believe that you are and if self-defined on the inside, and there's no transcendent truth to question that or to hold you accountable to anything otherwise, then you have to live from that inside out. The true gospel, as we would see it, is first of all, and this is why we answer these questions this way, is that who am I? Well, first of all, I don't define self for myself. I am who God has said that I am, which is first and foremost a human being made in his image, designed not to satisfy self or to make inside match outsides, at least not first. First thing that I'm called to do is to be restored to him through the work of Jesus, and now to live a life that gives glory to God by loving him and loving other people. Now here's where some of that hallmark stuff actually can ring a little bit true and confuse us, because now at that point, if God has defined who I am, and I've been changed by Jesus, and Jesus has given me a new heart, and the Spirit of God lives inside me, and now my wanter, my desires, my loves, and everything else have been rightly ordered, now we can say, what's happened on the inside, that's what I want to live on the outside. And now that is true, but not if I'm self-defining and I'm lopping myself off as some autonomous being. That's where you get into all kind of trouble. But culturally, among the many different things that we could say, and I'll refer you to Trevin's talk for more of those, I think that's the one that is probably the hardest to understand, the trickiest to deal with, and the one that right now is the most dangerous for our people.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, that'll lead me to just one more question, and then we'll take a look at Slido. And it's a huge one, so you don't have to cover it entirely. But then what does political engagement look like in light of that?
Well, I don't know how we got there from here. I'm just kidding.
This is our political and social moment. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot that could be said. I'm not asking for details of who you vote for, but really just maybe a little bit more broadly. Like, what is wise political engagement when you see so many of your neighbors going down these foolish, dangerous, destructive paths?
Yep. So on the Center for Faith and Culture blog, just last week, I actually wrote a piece called The Way of Christ in Politics. And so I have 5 or 6 points there that you can go and look at. But here's just a couple of things that I'll drive home here for this conversation. First is, my guess is if I were to come to almost all of you and just say, what is your political participation? You would probably say, no, I'm not in politics. I don't have anything to do with politics. But the truth is, every one of us are already part of a body politic. You are a citizen of somewhere. And by virtue of being a citizen of somewhere, and especially, this is kind of back to that time and place conversation, we are so gifted and so blessed to be in a time and in a place, at least in the United States, where we still have a voice, guys. You may feel like it's not heard that well, or you may not be happy with your options or whatever, but you have a voice. You have a voice at the federal level. You have a voice at the state level. And I would say most importantly, you have a voice at the local level. So I would immediately begin pushing towards, first of all, recognizing that a government is good for us. It's good for us as human beings because God has designed us to live under authority. Government is one of those things that are part of God's design. And that actually, especially in the time and place in which we live, we have an opportunity to move the needle in some of those governmental issues, especially local issues. Very quickly, in the county in which I live, a handful of the things that can be most frustrating right now have to do with the curriculum that kids are taught in public schools. Well, guess what? You can have a voice in that. I can have a voice in that. I can't change it all by myself, but I can have a certain body politic participation where I'm just taking my responsibility as one citizen, one concerned and interested parent, and just say, I want to offer and advocate for that which I think is good, true, and beautiful, and for that to be reflected in my kids' curriculum. I can't do it all by myself, but I can do something. Another thing, we built a house a couple of years ago. My wife opened a coffee shop, so we have had our fair share of inspectors and people who walk around with code books and people who say you can do this and you can't do that and it costs this amount of money and that kind of stuff. And in multiple times, in multiple of these instances, it is very clear to say or to see that's not just. That's actually quite unfair. That's unjust. and that is instantiated into some of the local code and the local practices and the local laws. And that actually, I know, is unfair to certain people. It's privileging some and it's hurting others, and that's not good. That's not good for society. Well, guess what? We have opportunity to, at times, be part of or maybe run for a certain position on a local town board, or to go and to talk to the magistrates or the town commissioners and just say, if y'all recognize that this is a problem, and for the sake of my neighbors, these are ways in which I can participate in the body politic that are not trying to get on CNN. It's just trying to actually make sure that my neighbors are not taken advantage of. So we can all do those kind of things, and a million other examples. But I would just say immediately, even if you think, I have nothing to do with politics, I don't like politics, the fact is, it's just like economics. You're already part of the system. You're already swept up in it. You don't really have a choice. And actually, I think to push it the other direction, we have a responsibility to be as good of citizens as we can.
Excellent. Okay, yeah, we got a couple questions here in Slido. Those are great answers. Thank you so much, Dr. Quinn. Let's, for a second here, maybe step away from the West, step away from America. This was a good question. I'll just read it as it's stated here. There tends to be a view of Christ and culture in a specifically American context. What if we think about Christ and culture in a global context? Are there some maybe different emphases or things that we should talk about when we step away from the West for a second? I mean, certainly the particularities, but yeah.
So I think that our approach of encouraging people to, first of all, we're talking about a specific God. We're talking about the one true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who has revealed himself to us as Father, Son, and Spirit. That doesn't change regardless of what time or place that you're in. The call to walk faithfully with Jesus doesn't change regardless of what time and place you're in. It's some of the cultural particulars that can change. I can imagine then, even though Dennis and I are quite committed to a grace restores nature approach, and in the West, we still live in a time when, generally speaking, we can probably see the needle move culturally towards things that more reflect the way of Christ in His world. But if we were to pick up right now and to be dropped into North Korea, our approach may be one that to walk faithfully with Jesus there, it may be one that will be one that looks very different. That may be one that would look like a little more of a Christ against culture. And that's not because we don't think the world's good, but because it is such a closed system and such a place that offers no opportunity or such little opportunity that you either have to really be against what's going on culturally in order to try to advocate for that which is good, true, and beautiful, or you just have to be some type of a monastic. So at that point, Rod Dreher makes a whole lot of sense, right? So I just to zoom out in that way, you have to use those extremes to clarify the murky middle. Our confession about who God is, what His world is, who we are, none of those things change. But I do want to be clear that sometimes the wisest approach is one where actually you may have to just keep your mouth quiet a lot of times and live as faithfully as you can. Indeed, your words, you may not have a lot of options with your words, but in deeds you can be as faithful as you can and then share your words when you're able. And then there's other times when our words can be heard and we have opportunity to be quite vocal and verbal and to write and to speak and those kind of things, as well as match that with our deeds. Here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that there's ever a time where you just stop sharing the gospel. I'm not saying that. But I think of examples of people who, sometimes overzealous Americans, who will go to certain parts of Asia and they'll get over there where Christianity is virtually illegal, and they'll say, I'm going to get on the street corner and I'm going to start street preaching. And I'm like, wait a minute, you might actually be doing more harm than good. Do we share the gospel? Of course. But you might want to consider the time and place right there, because you inadvertently and in your virtuous zeal, you might actually make life more complicated for the Christians who have to live there forever. So there may be wiser approaches to this in order to make disciples and to honor Jesus.
We had another question about vocation. You've written a book about vocation. So how do we take what we've talked about today regarding Christ and culture and apply that to our vocation?
The first thing I would say with respect to vocation is when you say the word vocation, most of the time, and I think this is what Rob means, we're talking about what we do for work, what you get paid to do. I think the word vocation is much broader than that. But if we're talking about how we apply this to our work, there are a few things that come to mind. First is recognize that work is part of what you're created to do. Work is not a result of the fall. Work also, if you want a definition of that, I think work is what creatures do with creation. That's my definition of work, what creatures do with creation. Benjamin, seems like a really broad definition. Well, it probably is. But let me give you a few examples of things that I've done with creation today. I made my bed today, just like I do virtually every morning. My wife and I have this thing where whoever gets out of bed last is who has to make the bed. And for whatever reason, I end up making it a whole bunch. I did that. Also helped my kids get ready for school. I drove them to a particular place, dropped them off, so on and so forth. Okay, that's great, Benjamin, that you did all those things, and I didn't get paid for one of them. And I don't think I'll ever get paid for making my bed. I'll cut my grass. I'll blow off the porches. All these are things I do with creation. I feed the dogs. I walk the horse. I do all these kind of things. Nobody's paying me for that. And nobody's denying that that's work. Well, I also came to Southeastern today, and I've answered way too many emails. I hate emails. Please don't send me any emails. I'm kind of joking about that. If you want to meet, I'd love to meet you. I just don't like emails. Answer emails, write books, teach classes, meet with people, those kind of things. I do get paid for that kind of stuff. So which one of those is work? Well, all of those things is work. Some things we get paid to do, some things we don't. But all of these are things that we do with creation. And at every place where we as creatures put our hand to the plow of the creation, at every place we have an opportunity to either advance the way of Jesus in his world or not. To either advance it or push the creation, form the creation in the direction, the way of wisdom, the way of Jesus, or in the way of folly. We're able to engage other people or to do our work in such a way that either honors Christ our Savior, who, by the way, we knew as carpenter, most people before they knew him as the Christ. Either to shape the world in a way that honors Christ our Savior or doesn't honor Christ our Savior. And so every time you may be shelving books in the library, or you may be writing a blog or an editorial piece of some sort. You may be raising money. You may be doing a counseling session. You may be teaching a class. Whatever it is that you get paid to do or don't get paid to do, at every point where we as the imagers of God, those who bear the image of God, put our hand to the plow of creation, we have an opportunity to advance the way of Christ in his world. Think about the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. At every point in our work, we have the opportunity to reflect the way of Christ or not. And I would just start the conversation there. That's a high view of creation. It's a very high view of Jesus. It's a high view of our responsibility before God in his world. And I think a very thick view of how we love God and love neighbor.
Great. We've got time for one more question. And we've kind of hit on this a little bit, but the question was essentially, what if you kind of resonate with some of the multiple paradigms of Christ and culture? So I guess my question is, would it be fair to say that for y'all, the overarching approach is Christ as the transformer of culture? Yeah. Some contexts you kind of emphasize it might be more against, some maybe above, and some, I mean, I don't know. It seems like there's elements that you can draw on, but maybe the overarching approach is Christ as the transformer of culture. Is that right?
That's a good way to say it, Rob. So this is where we do have to take a wide-angle lens to history and recognize and remember that history is the theater through which God is executing and deploying and carrying out his entire plan. If you lived in the time of Nero, you're probably, at least the way that you approach may look more like a Christ against kind of thing, because you don't know how to be for something like that. Or if you lived during the Diocletian persecution, which was the worst of the persecutions in the early church, if you lived in that time, it would look quite differently than it would at sort of the high time of Constantine. That doesn't change that what we think God is actually doing across the big picture of time and space is that the gospel is restoring the whole of creation through the work of Jesus, and especially with relation to his imagers. Yeah. But there are times and places in the history, and in certain time, even right now, same time, but different parts of the world, where the expression or the posture will have to look different because of the cultural conditions.
Great. Well, great, Dr. Quinn. This was incredible. Thank you so much for being here. Let's find out who is the lucky winner of our book. John is bringing it forward here. And it will be Eleanor Taylor. Is that right? Eleanor Taylor. All right, come forward and receive this volume and give it a read, maybe over the winter break.
It's a great book. You'll love it.
It's great. Exactly. Dr. Quinn, thank you again. Do you have a few moments after the talk to chat with folks?
Glad to.
Great. So this was our last event for the semester. We can look towards Thanksgiving and finals and Christmas break. Thank you all so much for being here. If there's any more donuts, please take them. Get some coffee on your way out. Have a chat with Dr. Quinn if you'd like, and y'all are dismissed.
Thanks, guys.